She ran. Barefoot. Gasping for air. A hospital bracelet still clung to her wrist, the numbers smudged with sweat. The streets were empty, the city asleep, but she wasn't alone. Behind her, footsteps pounded against the pavement, steady and relentless. She had minutes. Maybe seconds. Her body, weak from labor, threatened to collapse, but the sheer force of terror pushed her forward. She stumbled, caught herself, and dared to glance back. The streetlights flickered overhead, a cruel trick of the universe, revealing only glimpses of her pursuer. A silhouette. A shadow stretching across the asphalt. And the unmistakable glint of metal in his hand. She screamed. It was raw, desperate. The kind of scream that should wake the dead. But the windows above remained dark. No one stirred. No one was coming. A car passed in the distance, headlights briefly illuminating her face. Her lips trembled, eyes wild with fear, but the car kept moving. She was running out of time. The hospital was only 4 blocks away. She could still see it, the faint glow of its emergency sign pulsing like a heartbeat. A place meant to save lives. A place she had been lying in just hours before, cradling her child. A child she would never see again if she didn't reach safety. Then, the first shot rang out. A deafening crack, splitting the night. Pain. Searing, white-hot, ripping through flesh. Her knees buckled. Another shot. She collapsed onto the pavement, gasping, blood pooling beneath her fingers. She tried to move. Tried to drag herself forward. Her vision blurred, but she saw him now, standing over her, breathing hard, gun still raised. No words. No hesitation. The final shot echoed through the empty street. And just like that, silence. The echoes of the gunfire faded into the quiet hum of the city. Streetlights flickered overhead, casting pools of artificial light onto the pavement, illuminating the stillness of the woman's body. The warmth of her breath had vanished. The trembling in her fingers had ceased. The hospital bracelet, now stained crimson, glowed faintly beneath the glow of the sodium lamps. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A siren wailed, far away, too far to matter. He stood over her, shoulders rising and falling with each measured breath. The weight of the gun in his hand was familiar, his fingers curled around the grip as if molded to it. He didn't move right away. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, his pulse steady. Then, as if pulled by an invisible thread, he turned. His footsteps echoed against the empty asphalt, deliberate, unhurried. He had known this moment would come. He had rehearsed it in his mind over and over, but standing there now, surrounded by the evidence of his own violence, he felt nothing. No regret. No relief. Just the silence of a city that had chosen to sleep through the crime. The first call to 911 wouldn't come for another 7 minutes. A man walking home from the night shift, a tired set of footsteps pausing just long enough to take in the horror before scrambling for his phone. There's a woman, she's lying in the street. I think she's been shot. Oh God, there's so much blood. The dispatcher's voice remained steady, trained for moments like this. Is she breathing? A pause. The sound of hurried footsteps moving closer. A sharp inhale. I don't think so. By the time officers arrived, the blood had begun to seep into the cracks of the pavement, trickling downward like ink through fractured stone. The streetlights overhead buzzed softly. A breeze moved through the alleyways, tugging at the edges of her hospital gown. The crime scene unfolded in slow motion. A growing cluster of flashing lights. Officers moving swiftly but carefully. Yellow tape pulled taut around the perimeter, sealing off the horror from the rest of the world. Detectives arrived within the hour, faces drawn, voices low. One knelt beside the body, eyes scanning for details, for something, anything, that might offer an explanation beyond the obvious. A woman. Young. Recently given birth. Shot multiple times. It was a murder, clear and deliberate. But the question, the one that would consume investigators in the days to come, wasn't just who had done this. That, perhaps, would be the easy part. The real question was why. Because this wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. The evidence suggested something calculated, something deeply personal. A crime that had been building long before the first shot was ever fired. As officers canvassed the area, speaking in hushed voices to the few witnesses who had heard the gunfire but seen nothing, paramedics moved carefully, respectfully. They checked for signs of life they knew they wouldn't find. They placed a white sheet over her body. The scene became still again, save for the occasional crackle of a police radio, the distant hum of the city just beginning to stir. And then, a discovery. One of the officers, scanning the scene with a flashlight, stopped abruptly. Just a few feet from where the body lay, partially hidden in the gutter, was something small. A phone. Unlocked. The screen cracked from the fall. And on it, one final text message. A message sent at 11:52 p.m. Just minutes before the first shot was fired. 3 words. He found me. The screen of the phone glowed faintly in the dark, illuminating those 3 words. A message sent in desperation, a silent plea to someone on the other end. But the question gnawed at investigators: who had she been trying to reach? And why had they never responded? Detectives moved swiftly, securing the device in an evidence bag, careful not to smudge any potential fingerprints. A tech unit would analyze it soon enough, extracting call logs, texts, anything that could explain how a woman who had given birth just hours before had ended up bleeding in the street, hunted down like prey. At the hospital, just 4 blocks away, nurses moved in and out of rooms, adjusting 4 drips, checking vital signs, oblivious to the horror unfolding nearby. Somewhere in the maternity ward, a newborn slept soundly, swaddled in hospital linens, unaware that the woman who had carried them for 9 months would never hold them again. It wasn't long before hospital staff were approached by detectives, their quiet inquiries breaking the monotony of the night shift. Questions were asked, records reviewed. A nurse, tired and overworked, recounted the woman's final hours in the hospital. She had been admitted the previous evening, labor progressing as expected. There was no indication of distress, no mention of a threat lurking outside the hospital walls. But then, after delivering her child, something changed. Her demeanor had shifted. She had asked about early discharge, about how soon she could leave. The nurses had advised against it. She was weak, exhausted. It wasn't normal for a mother to want to leave so soon. Yet, by 10:45 p.m., she had checked herself out against medical advice. She had signed the discharge forms with trembling hands, her gaze darting toward the window as if she expected someone to be watching. No one had stopped her. No one had known the danger waiting for her beyond those hospital doors. By 11:15 p.m., security footage showed her stepping into the cold night. She wasn't alone. A man stood near the entrance. The footage was grainy, the angle poor, but his posture was unmistakable. Rigid. Unmoving. Watching. She didn't hesitate. She walked past him, clutching her hospital bag, and vanished down the sidewalk. He followed moments later. Back at the precinct, investigators combed through Sarah Daniels' life with meticulous precision. Her apartment was searched, belongings catalogued, every inch of her existence dissected for a clue as to why she had ended up in the street, gunned down in cold blood. Her phone, once unlocked, painted a picture of a woman running from something, or someone. There were missed calls. Repeated numbers. Some saved under names that meant nothing to detectives. Others, more telling, calls to emergency contacts that had never been returned. And then, a conversation thread. One that sent a ripple of unease through the investigation. The messages started innocently enough. A name appeared at the top, Mark Evans. A man she had known. A man she had once trusted. But the last exchange was different. Mark Evans, 10:38 p.m. You can't run forever, Sarah. We both know how this ends. Sarah Daniels, 10:40 p.m. Please. I just had the baby. Just let me go. Mark Evans, 10:41 p.m. Too late for that. The implications were undeniable. The man had threatened her. She had begged him to stop. Minutes later, she was dead. Detectives now had their prime suspect. A man with a history. A man who had every reason to want Sarah Daniels silenced. But there was one problem. Mark Evans had an alibi. And it was airtight. Mark Evans had spent the night at a bar across town, a place where the neon lights never dimmed, where the sound of laughter and the clinking of glasses masked the passage of time. Bartenders, security cameras, and at least a dozen patrons placed him there from 9 p.m. until well after midnight. He had never left. He had never stepped foot near the hospital, near the street where Sarah Daniels had taken her final breath. Yet his message, his chilling, unmistakable warning, had been sent minutes before she was killed. Detectives sat across from him in the interrogation room, the weight of the case pressing down on them. He was calm, too calm, fingers tapping lazily against the cold metal table as they laid out the evidence before him. The texts. The threats. The fact that Sarah Daniels had feared for her life, running into the night, desperate to escape. And yet, with all of it staring him in the face, he only smiled. I never left the bar, he said, his voice steady, unwavering. Check the cameras. I was there all night. The lead detecting for a crack in his confidence. There was none. He leaned forward, dropping Sarah's phone onto the table between them. You told her she couldn't run forever, he said, voice measured, watching for a reaction. What did you mean by that? Mark barely glanced at the phone. I meant exactly what I said. She'd been running from her past for years. We both knew it would catch up to her eventually. The detective narrowed his eyes. And what past is that? A slow, knowing smirk tugged at the corner of Mark's mouth. You think I pulled the trigger, don't you? He shook his head, exhaling a quiet laugh. If I wanted Sarah dead, she'd have been gone a long time ago. A beat of silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken truths. Mark leaned back in his chair, tilting his head slightly. You're asking the wrong questions, detective. Instead of asking who killed her, maybe you should be asking why she left the hospital in the first place. Why was she so desperate to get away? The detective watched him carefully. He had interviewed enough men like Mark to recognize when someone wasn't afraid. Mark wasn't worried about being arrested. He wasn't scrambling for an alibi. He wasn't even trying to prove his innocence. Because he already knew they wouldn't be able to pin this murder on him. And that meant one thing. There was someone else. Back at the precinct, the team pored over Sarah's records again. Phone logs, financial statements, medical history, every piece of her life was spread out across the room, dissected with an obsessive intensity. She had drained her bank account 3 days before her murder. Nearly everything had been withdrawn in cash. She had booked a bus ticket. One way. To a city 4 states away. She had never gotten on that bus. They dug deeper, looking past the obvious connections. Mark was the easiest suspect, the one with the most motive. But his alibi was unshakable, which meant Sarah's death wasn't just about a bitter ex-lover. It was about something bigger. Then, at 2:17 a.m., a breakthrough. One of the analysts flagged a number buried in Sarah's call history. A call she had made at 11:50 p.m., just 2 minutes before her final text. The call had lasted only 7 seconds. It had gone unanswered. The number was unregistered. A burner phone. But a reverse search pulled up a connection. The number had been used to make one other call earlier that same night. To a name no one had seen before. Detectives tracked it back to a rental property in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of town. The tenant was listed as Daniel Carter, a name that had never once appeared in Sarah's life. No calls, no emails, no financial ties. But Daniel Carter didn't exist. The ID used to rent the house was fake. The phone linked to an anonymous prepaid account. Whoever had been on the other end of that call didn't want to be found. And that made them dangerous. By morning, a new name surfaced. A name whispered by a confidential informant, someone who had once brushed shoulders with the kind of people who operated in shadows, the kind of people who didn't leave loose ends. Sarah Daniels, it seemed, had been running from more than just an ex. She had been running from a man no one dared to speak about. A man whose name wasn't found in police records, but in the hushed conversations of those who knew better than to ask questions. A man known only as Holloway. No first name. No official records. Just a reputation. And a trail of people who had disappeared without a trace. The name Holloway sent a ripple of unease through the precinct. It wasn't a name that showed up in official databases. There were no arrest records, no driver's license, no paper trail of any kind. It was the kind of name spoken in back rooms, exchanged in whispers by those who knew better than to dig too deep. The confidential informant refused to say much, just that Holloway wasn't someone you found. He was someone who found you. And when he did, you never outran him. Detectives worked through the morning, trying to piece together any connection between Holloway and Sarah Daniels. The more they searched, the more questions they uncovered. Sarah had no criminal history. No known ties to organized crime. On paper, she was just another woman trying to start over. A single mother with a past she was trying to outrun. But the evidence told a different story. Her bank withdrawals. The burner phone. The frantic way she had left the hospital that night. She hadn't just been running from an ex. She had been running from something far more dangerous. By noon, the team had a new lead. A name buried in old police reports. A man who had once been charged in a federal case involving identity fraud, money laundering, and missing persons. His name was Vincent Delacroix. And he had disappeared 7 years ago. His case file was thin, almost too thin for a man suspected of laundering millions for groups that didn't officially exist. The investigation had stalled, witnesses had recanted, and evidence had vanished. Delacroix had slipped off the grid, just another ghost in a world built to erase people like him. But something in his case file stood out. A former partner. A woman who had cooperated with investigators for a short time before suddenly withdrawing from the case. Her name? Sarah Daniels. The pieces started falling into place. Sarah hadn't just been running from an abusive ex. She had been running from a past that had been closing in on her for years. And the man who had finally caught up to her. It wasn't Mark Evans. It was Holloway. The team worked fast, tracing any loose threads that might connect Sarah's murder to Holloway. They dug into burner phone purchases, financial transactions, surveillance footage, anything that could confirm he was in the city that night. Then, a breakthrough. A security camera. A grainy, low-resolution image taken from a gas station just a mile from the hospital. A man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a hooded jacket. He paid in cash. No credit cards. No traceable transactions. But his face, partially visible in a moment of bad luck, was enough. Facial recognition software ran the image against every database available. One result. Not from a government database. Not from a criminal record. But from a missing persons report. Filed 15 years ago. The name listed? Daniel Holloway. A boy who had disappeared at the age of 17. A runaway. A troubled kid who had fallen off the map. Except he hadn't disappeared. He had become something else. Something untraceable. The kind of man who existed only in whispers. And now, he had resurfaced. Only this time, it was for murder. The precinct was silent in the early morning hours, the hum of computer monitors the only sound as detectives sifted through mountains of records, old cases, and witness statements that had long been buried. The name Holloway echoed in their minds, a phantom that had haunted the underworld for years, slipping through cracks in the system, leaving behind only whispers. He had been a boy once, a missing person, a runaway. Then he had become something else. Something untraceable. Something lethal. Sarah Daniels had known the truth. And now, Sarah Daniels was dead. Detective Grant sat at his desk, eyes scanning the last text message Sarah had sent before she was gunned down in the street. He found me. The weight of those 3 words was suffocating. It was the kind of message that carried an unspoken finality. She had known there would be no escape. She had known, in those final moments, that whoever had been chasing her wasn't going to stop. And neither would they. By noon, the investigation had shifted focus. No more dead-end searches. No more wasted time chasing ghosts. They weren't looking for who had killed Sarah anymore. They were looking for why she had been running in the first place. And that meant going back to the beginning. Daniel Holloway had vanished on a cold January night in 2008. A 17-year-old runaway from a foster system that had failed him too many times. His case had been filed like thousands of others, another lost kid swallowed by the streets. No suspects. No evidence of foul play. But what made his case different was that it hadn't stayed closed. 5 years after his disappearance, a federal investigation into underground criminal networks had flagged his name. Not as a victim. As a person of interest. A boy who had supposedly run away, but had resurfaced under a new name. A name tied to Sarah Daniels. Sarah had been 23 at the time, working under an alias, assisting an organization known for one thing, erasing people. Holloway had been one of their clients. Or maybe, he had been something more. It had been an early morning raid, dozens of federal agents storming a quiet suburban home in Arizona. The people inside had been wanted for years, known only by whispers in law enforcement circles. They had given new identities to criminals, government defectors, and people who wanted to vanish forever. Sarah Daniels had been there. So had Daniel Holloway. But when the smoke cleared, only Sarah had been taken into custody. And Holloway? Gone. He had disappeared just as suddenly as he had 5 years earlier, slipping into the wind, leaving no trace behind. Sarah had cooperated at first, answering questions, identifying names. But something had changed. 3 weeks into protective custody, she had stopped talking. 6 months later, she was gone. No explanation. No warning. Just another ghost. And now, a decade later, she was dead. Detectives knew they had one chance to track Holloway before he disappeared again. His presence in the city meant something. He hadn't just killed Sarah and vanished. He had lingered. He had watched. And that meant he was still somewhere close. The next step was surveillance. They knew from the gas station footage that he had been on foot. No car. No traceable vehicle registrations. That meant he had either been dropped off or was staying some. Supplies someone might take if they had been on the run for a long time. And next to it, scrawled onto a piece of plywood in black marker, were 3 words. He's watching me. The air shifted. Somewhere in the distance, a metal pipe clattered to the ground. Someone else was here. The detectives moved fast, sweeping through the site, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. They moved up the unfinished staircases, through the exposed hallways, checking every corner, every space where someone could be hiding. Then they heard it. Footsteps. Fast. Running. The chase began in an instant. A shadow darted across the second floor, moving between the steel beams, slipping between unfinished walls. The detectives followed, pushing forward, the pounding of their own footsteps mixing with the sound of whoever was running from them. "Stop," one of them shouted. "Elena! Stop!" But she didn't. She bolted for an opening in the framework, her silhouette visible for only a split second before she leaped. For a breathless moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the sound of impact. A hard, uneven landing. The detectives reached the edge just in time to see her staggering to her feet, gripping her ankle, pain flashing across her face. She had landed one floor below, a drop too far to make cleanly. She was trapped. And she knew it. At the station, Elena sat in the interrogation room, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched coffee. Her fingers trembled slightly, though whether from exhaustion or fear, no one could say. She was quiet at first. Guarded. Her eyes darted to the corners of the room, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any second. But it wasn't until they showed her the last text message Sarah had sent, the words, "He found me," that she finally broke. Her breath shuddered. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke. "You don't understand," she said. Sarah wasn't afraid of him. A pause. She was afraid of them. Elena hesitated before continuing, her words slow, deliberate. She wasn't just telling them a story. She was revealing something she had never said out loud before. Sarah Daniels had been part of a network, a group that specialized in making people disappear. But it wasn't just about giving new identities. It was about control. Some people were given new lives. Others were turned into something else. And Daniel Holloway had been one of them. She didn't know the full extent of what had happened to him after the safe house raid in 2013. Only that when he resurfaced, he wasn't the same person anymore. "They broke him," Elena whispered. "And then they rebuilt him. A tool. A weapon. Something more dangerous than anyone could have predicted. And now, the people who had created him wanted him dead." The realization changed everything. Daniel Holloway hadn't come back to kill Sarah because of old grudges. He had come back because Sarah had been trying to expose the truth. She had been running because she had known what they would do to her if they found out. And now, Holloway was in the crosshairs, too. The people who had created him were cleaning house. And that meant there was only one question left to answer. Who would find him first? The detectives? Or the people who had turned him into a ghost in the first place? Because if it was the latter, Daniel Holloway wouldn't just disappear this time. He would be erased. The city never slept. Somewhere between the glow of streetlights and the hum of late-night traffic, things moved beneath the surface, things most people never noticed, never questioned. But those who lived in the margins, those who had spent their lives looking over their shoulders, they knew better. Elena Vasquez had spent the past 2 years existing in that space, in the silence between shifting shadows. And now, for the first time since she had disappeared, she was being forced to stop running. Detectives watched her closely from the other side of the glass. She had spoken in fragments, her words carefully measured, as if saying too much would somehow summon the thing she feared most. But they needed more. Because Daniel Holloway wasn't just a missing person. He wasn't just a killer. He was the key to something much bigger. And if what Elena was saying was true, then he wasn't just running for his life. He was running out of time. The detectives replayed Elena's words, dissecting every detail. The organization that had given people new identities wasn't just covering its tracks. It was eliminating loose ends. Sarah had been one of those ends. Elena was another. And now, so was Holloway. The pieces were finally beginning to fit together, but there was still one question left unanswered. Where was he now? Then came the phone call. It was routed through multiple numbers, bouncing across state lines before finally landing at the precinct. A male voice, low and controlled. "You don't have much time." The line went dead. But the number? It was traced back to a payphone 3 blocks from the station. Daniel Holloway had just reached out. The location was set. An abandoned motel on the outskirts of town, a place that had once been a roadside refuge before time and neglect turned it into something else. The kind of place where people went to disappear. The kind of place where bodies were sometimes found when the sun came up. Detectives didn't go in blind. Surveillance was set up, exits were covered, but the tension was thick. Then, just past midnight, a lone figure stepped out of the darkness. Daniel Holloway. He didn't run. He didn't reach for a weapon. He just stood there, hands at his sides, as if he had already accepted whatever was about to happen. His face was leaner than in the old photos. His eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much, lost too much. He had been a ghost for years. And now, he was done hiding. The interrogation room was silent. Holloway didn't move, didn't blink. "They're coming," he said, voice even, almost detached. The detectives leaned in. "Who?" His jaw tensed. "The people who built me." The room seemed to shrink. Holloway didn't waste time explaining how it all started. He didn't need to. The scars on his body, the ones just barely visible beneath the collar of his shirt, told part of the story. After the 2013 raid, he had been taken, not by law enforcement, but by the same people Sarah and Elena had been trying to escape. He had been trained, conditioned, turned into something useful. And when he had finally broken free, they hadn't come looking for him. Not at first. Because they had assumed he was still theirs. But when Sarah had started reaching out, when she had begun to pull at the edges of the past, they had taken notice. And now, they were tying up every loose end. He hadn't killed Sarah. He had tried to save her. But he had been too late. The precinct went on high alert. If Holloway was right, then the people who had made him what he was wouldn't just let him walk away. They would come for him. And they would come for Elena. Detectives moved fast, setting up a safe house, securing locations, but it wasn't enough. Because by the time they reached the safe house, the door was already open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder. 2 officers were down. And Elena Vasquez was gone. The clock was ticking now. And this time, if they didn't move fast enough, she wouldn't just be missing. She would be dead. Holloway knew where they would take her. Not a safe house. Not a facility. Somewhere final. A place where unfinished business was taken care of, where people vanished without a trace. He had been there before. And now, he was going back. The abandoned shipping yard on the east side of town had been quiet for years. It was the kind of place people forgot about, a rusted skeleton of a once thriving industry. But tonight, it wasn't empty. Tonight, it was a graveyard waiting to be filled. Detectives moved in fast, cutting the lights, moving in shadows. Holloway moved with them, his eyes scanning the perimeter, looking for any sign of Elena. Then, a scream. Muffled. Distant. They moved fast. Gunfire erupted, slicing through the silence. One by one, figures dropped in the darkness, faceless men, well-trained, but not untouchable. And then, through the chaos, Holloway found her. Elena, bound to a chair, bruised but breathing. Their eyes met, and for a moment, there was something almost human in his expression. Something that had been missing for years. The past had been chasing them for too long. Tonight, it ended. The aftermath by sunrise, the bodies had been counted. The evidence had been collected. The organization exposed. Their files were uncovered, their network dismantled, their operations shattered beyond repair. Elena Vasquez was finally free. Holloway. He disappeared before the sun came up. No goodbyes. No explanations. Just gone. But this time, for the first time, he wasn't running. He was choosing to walk away. And somewhere in the city, in the quiet of the early morning, the ghosts of the past finally began to fade. The case may be closed, but the questions remain. Was Daniel Holloway a hero seeking redemption, or was he simply a man running from the monster he had become? And what about the organization? How many more secrets remain buried, waiting to be uncovered? Tell us what you think in the comments. Do you believe justice was truly served? Or do you think the real players behind this story are still out there, pulling the strings? If you want more gripping true crime stories like this, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Like this video if you were on the edge of your seat. Share it with someone who loves a mystery. And remember, some stories never really end. They just wait for someone to uncover the truth.